In June 1314, near Stirling on the fields of Bannockburn, two armies prepared for a clash that would decide Scotland's fate. On one side stood King Robert the Bruce, hardened by years of guerrilla warfare and driven by a vision of independence. On the other side stood Edward II of England, commanding the might of one of Europe's strongest kingdoms. Outnumbered but determined, the Scots prepared to fight not just for land, but for freedom. What followed was a battle that shattered English power in Scotland and forged a legend that still echoes centuries later. The roots of this conflict lay in the late 13th century. In 1286, King Alexander III of Scotland died suddenly, leaving only his young granddaughter Margaret, the Maid of Norway, as heir. Before she could take the throne, she too died in 1290, plunging Scotland into a succession crisis. Rival nobles pressed their claims, and the lords turned to Edward I of England to arbitrate. Known as the Hammer of the Scots, Edward backed John Balliol as king, but reduced him to a puppet, treating Scotland as a vassal. This humiliation sparked rebellion. In 1297, William Wallace and Andrew Moray led an uprising, defeating the English at the Battle of Stirling Bridge. But in 1298 Edward I struck back, crushing Wallace at Falkirk. In 1305 Wallace was captured and executed in London, his martyrdom inspiring new resistance. Among those inspired was Robert Bruce, grandson of one of the original claimants to the throne. In 1306 Bruce seized the crown after killing his rival John Comyn in a church. Excommunicated and hunted, he seemed doomed, yet through resilience and strategy he gradually reclaimed Scotland piece by piece. By 1314 Bruce had built a reputation as a tactician. He relied on ambushes, raids, and scorched earth tactics, destroying castles that could not be held. His persistence frustrated Edward II, who lacked his father's military genius but shared his obsession with Scotland. The crisis centered on Stirling Castle. In 1313, Edward Bruce besieged it, and the English garrison agreed to surrender unless relieved by midsummer 1314. Forced to act, Edward II raised an army of over 15,000, far larger than Bruce's 6,000. As the English advanced, Bruce prepared his forces near Bannockburn, ready for a decisive showdown. On the evening of June 22, 1314, as the summer sun sank beyond the horizon, the Scottish and English armies faced one another along the Bannockburn near Stirling. With Stirling Castle and Scotland's future at stake, Robert the Bruce held the high ground, his smaller host perhaps a quarter of Edward II's hardened by guerrilla war and long marches. Around campfires men sharpened spears, mended straps, and murmured prayers as priests moved among them. Fear gave way to a steely resolve. Bruce himself walked and rode among the ranks, a warrior king whose calm and choice of ground steadied his army. Across the burn, the vast English camp spread in a sea of tents, banners, and wagons. Knights boasted and drank, certain numbers, cavalry and longbows would sweep the Scots aside, though seasoned men muttered that this broken, marshy ground ill-suited a heavy charge. In his ornate pavilion Edward II sought prestige in a crushing victory, but he lacked his father's edge. At dusk came the moment that legend would keep. Bruce, lightly armored and riding a palfrey, was scouting near the front when Sir Henry de Bohun, nephew of the Earl of Hereford, spied him. De Bohun couched his lance and thundered forward to end the war at a stroke. At the last instant Bruce slipped aside and, rising in his stirrups, brought his axe down upon de Bohun's helmet, splitting it. The knight fell dead and Bruce's axe shaft snapped with the blow. The Scots roared, proof of their king's cool courage and, to many, a sign of favor. Night settled over uneasy camps, Scots prayed and readied for dawn. Among the English the loss stung, a reminder that this enemy was no easy prey. At first light on June 23 the fields rang with cries and restless hooves. Bruce's plan unfolded. His veterans advanced from the woods in tight schiltrons, bristling hedges of long spears, banners lifting in the wind as they formed on narrower, firmer ground. Edward's larger host moved first, columns of armored knights dressed their lines, lances leveled, and the ground began to tremble beneath a gathering charge. The Scots held fast. Front ranks planted spear butts and lowered points. When the cavalry struck, momentum shattered on the forest of steel. Horses reared and went down, riders tumbled and were crushed under their own mounts, and the first great shock of Bannockburn broke against an unyielding wall. At the ford of the Bannockburn, an English detachment tried to outflank Bruce, but the crossing was narrow and treacherous. Scots who knew the ground met them hard, hemmed by the water on one side and spear points on the other. Horses floundered in the marsh, men went down, and the assault collapsed into panic. Bruce's infantry counterattacked with disciplined fury, driving the enemy back from the ford and sending bodies and broken gear drifting downstream. The first day stunned the English. Expecting to sweep aside a smaller foe, they found their famed cavalry checked and bloodied while Scottish ranks held with order and courage. Frustration spread as cramped, boggy ground denied room to deploy numbers or bring longbowmen to full effect. Edward II, lacking his father's seasoned judgment, hesitated over how to adapt. Across the lines, Scottish confidence rose. The memory of Bruce splitting Sir Henry de Bohun's skull the previous evening was vivid, and the day's success confirmed faith in his leadership. By nightfall on June 23 the field lay strewn with shattered lances, dead horses, and fallen knights. The Scots withdrew in good order to strong positions, spirits high. The English, weary and chastened, raised camp once more, their numbers still imposing but their certainty shaken. Torchlight flickered over men who knew dawn would bring the real test. On June 24 the sun rose over Bannockburn to two armies set on destiny. Edward II commanded one of the largest hosts ever to enter Scotland, yet unease ran through his lines. Bruce's smaller army waited in silence, spearheads glinting, before battle clerics moved among the Scots. They knelt in prayer with spears planted upright, then rose as one and formed tighter schiltrons. Ignoring counsel to move cautiously on narrow, marshy approaches, Edward ordered a general advance. Waves of cavalry and foot pressed forward, the ground trembling. Bruce met them not only by holding but by pushing. The schiltrons rolled ahead like bristling hedgehogs, forcing back armored horsemen. Longbowmen crowded by their own found no clear fire, pressure mounted, formations buckled, and panic spread. Then camp followers poured from the hills with banners and clubs. To exhausted English troops it looked like fresh reinforcements, fear tipped to flight. Ranks broke, knights trampled their own foot, and the burn became a trap where men and horses drowned as they tried to cross. Edward II narrowly escaped capture. As the Scots surged forward, Edward II was forced from the field with only a small guard. He fled towards Stirling Castle, but its governor Sir Philip de Mowbray, knowing the fortress was bound to surrender, refused him entry. Edward barely escaped through Dunbar, eventually reaching England in disgrace. Behind him Bannockburn lay in Scottish hands. Thousands of English dead and prisoners carpeted the ground, arms, armor, and supplies abandoned. Yet the greatest prize was not material but the recognition that Scotland, against all odds, had prevailed. On June 24, 1314, silence fell over fields strewn with bodies and carrion birds. The once mighty English host had shattered and fled. Robert the Bruce stood victorious, his crown secure, his people free, and the world forced to acknowledge Scotland's strength. Among the fallen lay nobles and knights of England, entire households of chivalry destroyed. Thousands more were captured to be ransomed for immense sums that enriched Scotland. Edward's flight nearly ending in capture marked him with humiliation. Where his father Edward I had been feared as the hammer of the Scots, Edward II was scorned as the king who fled them. True to the terms of siege, Stirling Castle surrendered to Bruce. With it England lost its last major stronghold in central Scotland. The road south lay open and Bruce pressed his advantage. Bannockburn proved more than a military victory. It validated years of struggle and made Bruce's kingship unassailable. His schiltrons had demonstrated that disciplined infantry could break the charge of knights. Shifting the nature of medieval war, the triumph unified Scotland, binding nobles and commoners alike behind their king. Yet the war was not over. England still possessed vast resources and raids, sieges, and skirmishes continued, but momentum had changed. No longer could Scotland be dismissed as a rebellious province. It was a nation that had humbled its conqueror. Across Europe news of the battle spread. At courts in France and Rome, Scotland began to be seen as a legitimate kingdom, its victory inspiring those who dreamed of resisting greater powers. For Edward II, Bannockburn was both military and political ruin. His barons grew restless, his authority waned, and his failures in Scotland hastened his downfall. For Scotland, the victory was not only liberation but legend, a story carried through centuries as a symbol of defiance, courage, and freedom. Bannockburn did not end the wars, but it secured Scotland's spirit. Independence would remain contested, yet from that day the Scots knew they could never be easily conquered. The battlefield bore witness not only to bloodshed but to the rebirth of a nation. In later years, envoys pointed to Bannockburn as proof of sovereignty, the clearest expression coming in 1320 with the Declaration of Arbroath, a letter to the Pope affirming Scotland's independence, its stirring words pledging freedom. So long as 100 remained alive were the spiritual heirs of Bannockburn. The battle left a military legacy as well. It proved the strength of disciplined infantry against the charge of heavy cavalry. Once the terror of medieval Europe, the schiltron common men bristling with spears had brought down armored knights. This lesson spread across Europe, reshaping the balance between foot soldiers and cavalry in future wars. Bannockburn was thus not just a Scottish triumph but part of a wider transformation in the art of war. As generations passed, history became legend. Robert the Bruce grew into a larger-than-life figure, remembered not merely as king but as the warrior who embodied his people's soul. Tales of his courage and defiance filled bardic songs and fireside stories. Even the land itself seemed sanctified, fields and burns imagined as sacred ground where freedom was defended with steel and blood. In centuries that followed, whenever Scotland's independence or identity was challenged, Bannockburn returned as a rallying cry. Poets, patriots, and historians invoked it time and again. Most famously, Robert Burns centuries later immortalized the spirit in Scots' Wahey, written as if Bruce himself urged his men on the eve of battle. Bannockburn's greatest legacy lay not only in its immediate victory but in its timeless message that courage, unity, and resolve can overcome even the mightiest foe. For Scotland it was the day a small nation stood tall. For the world it was proof that history is not written only by the powerful but also by those who fight against impossible odds. The fields of Bannockburn, stained with blood more than 7 centuries ago, endure as a symbol of defiance and hope. Bannockburn was more than a battle, it was the making of a nation.